Hey team, welcome back to my channel. In this video, we will look at writing a complete web API using ASP.NET 6 to manage the backend, aka the database, for a to-do taskless application. I will be using CodeFirst to create the tables for this web API solution, and I'll write all the CRUD methods to support getting data in and out of that database. Now you'll see me write the insert statement, the update, delete methods, and I'll also be selecting data from our database, all using EF6. Now I'll be implementing repositories as well as DTOs. So team, are you ready to do this? Let's go. I'm using Visual Studio's 2022 File, New, Project. Maybe it's a recent project, or search in the drop-down combos for C# Windows Web. Look for ASP.NET Core Web API. Let's name this app todo.api. Select .NET6 and configure for HTTPS. That's all you need. Press that Create button to create this project. This is some sample source code. We don't need that. Please remove those two files. It's time to do a little house cleaning. Make sure your project has all of these folders. They're all important. Please don't miss one. It's time to install some packages. This project has a lot of packages, has 9 of them. Let's make sure you get all of them installed. Now, if you're unfamiliar on how to install packages, just right-click on Packages, Manage NuGet. See this search on the browse? Just type in each of these and just install them. It's that simple. This project will be using 3 entities: employee, status code, and user task. The employee entity class object is made up of 4 fields. Notice the employee ID is also set to be the primary key, and its value will be computed by an identity value. All 4 fields are required. The status code entity class object is just made up of 2 fields. Notice the code field is just 3 characters in length and is set to be the primary key. We will use this entity just to manage the status for each task. The user task object is the most important entity of this project. Notice the task ID is the primary key and its value is computed by an identity value. As you can see, all of the other fields are necessary and each has its own responsibility. Please type in these 3 class objects and save them to the appropriate file and folder. What we need to do now is go to DbContext and make a file called DataContents.cs. That's this file right here. Notice on lines 1 and 2, we're using 2 using statements, but I put the word global in front of using. Well, that makes it available to the entire application. Data content inherits from DbContext, and notice we have a constructor. And then notice on line 13 to 15, these are a list of our entities. And notice the name here is the plural of this. So user task, employee, employees. Now these will become our tables. Now you notice that when we did our objects, these will be our columns, these will be the attributes of the columns, and inside of our data contents, this will be the name of the table. Now none of this will work if we don't do this file correctly. Notice we say connection strings, notice the S at the end, and then we say default connection. Now this is our connection to the database. Notice that it comes up and I say server equals some name. And this is the server name. Let me show you how you should get that. So go to your database and say select @@ server name. See that name? Copy that, and that's what our program needs. So paste that in there in server name. And then the database name is where we're going to put that. I'm going to create it in a thing called Task Manager. And you can notice that here, Task Manager. So these are the 2 things that you need to remember from our database. other than your username and password. You're going to need those to make this connection string work correctly. So after database equals task manager, then you say user equals whatever your username is, then followed by a semicolon, password equals some password, and then multiple active result sets equal true. Now, Software Nuggets is not my real password and username, but that's just a placeholder for you to put your real username and password. Now that is in the file called appsetting.json. Notice right below that is called appsettings.development.json. Notice that you'll put that same pattern in this file, and there you have the settings for your database. Now our next file, program.cs, all of the things I'm about to tell you are important. Let us start off with our 3 using statements at the top. And then it comes down to a builder, web application create builder, arcs. And then what we're going to do is we're going to link up that service that we did in DbContext. Remember when we did that? And then the default connection, you're right, that comes from appsettings.json. That's that word. And we're going to use SQL Server. So builder services, add DbContext. That is ours right there. And then we're going to be saying we're using SQL Server, and that is the connection string. Now our controllers, we're going to add Newtonsoft. And if you've seen any of my previous videos, when we go to use programs like Postman and Swagger, sometimes we like to kick the output as XML. JSON is very popular, but there are some systems that are older and they still need XML. So why not just give that to them? Here, I'm setting up Swagger, and if my environment variable development is set up correctly, then we can use Swagger. I love this comment because it tells you exactly what to do for development, staging, and production. Right-click on that and then go all the way to the very bottom and hit Properties. Now when this picks up, we're going to go to Debug and then Open Debug Launch. And then notice here that ASP.NET Core environment is set to development. That's what we need to see. So we're in development mode, so we get to see Swagger. And then our last 5 lines, use HTTPS redirection, use routing, use authorization, map controller, and then run. Before we run the 2 migration scripts, notice that our entities are populated, our folder migration is empty, and our database task manager is empty. I don't have any tables. Let us begin. Our first command says change directory to todo.api. So how do we do that? cd to dir, and then we'll do our first command. Control C that. Let that run for a second. Started, succeeded, and we're success. Notice that our output directory has 2 files. Our first file has a list of all of our tables, employees, status code, and user task. We then have to apply this next statement to actually push it to our database. Paste in our second .NET EF database update command, hit enter. So now when we go check our database, we will have tables. Notice I've gone to the catalog task manager and we have our 3 tables. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of DTOs, let's compare it with entity. So notice in entity I have 3 classes, employee, status code, and task. Now it's important to know entities map directly over to our database. Notice employee has 4 fields, employee ID, first name, last name, and is active. In our database, employee ID, first name, last name is active. The data types kind of like map up to be the same. Booleans map to bit, strings map to mvarchar, and ints map to ints. Notice this one is a primary key. So you see the relationship between entities in your database. It's one-to-one, precise. Now, DTOs, they don't map to the database. What they do is they hide the database, and they only show users what they need to see. An example, in our employee, we have both first name and last name. But when I show it to the user, I show them full name. I concatenate the first name and last name and build full name. So sometimes we concatenate fields, sometimes we just leave it out. We don't show it. So this is all I want my users to see. I just want them to see a little bit. I don't want to let them see the data structure of my database. Now each DTO is made up of its fields and then a constructor. This is employee DTO. Status DTO, a list of fields and a constructor. User task DTO is our third DTO for this project. Notice that we have 6 fields, and this is all about, like managing tasks. And this is what I want to send back to the user. Now, it should be known that a question mark after a data type means that column is nullable. And that is also the case for a string, except when I say equals string.empty. The default value here would just be an empty string. The default value here would be a null. Notice here on our constructor, for this object, I'm using the task ID, the title, the due date, a nullable assigned to, a nullable status code, and a nullable date completed. Another important thing to understand about DTOs is, I know you only see 3 entities, 3 DTOs, but the truth of the matter is, DTOs show data to the end user, and we can have 3, 30, or 100 DTOs. It doesn't matter. However, we want to cut up the entities and show our users. That's what matters. You can see here on user task mini DTO, I'm just doing the task ID, the title, the due date, and the status. That's it. That's all they want to see. So that's another DTO. And there you have DTOs for the To-Do API. In the services folder, let us create 3 files, the IRepository.cs, the IStatusCodeRepository.cs, and the last file, IUserTaskRepository.cs. Let's create those 3 files. We are now going to look at the repository interfaces. So what is an interface and why are we using this? Well, first, an interface specifies to a class what needs to be done. We commonly call this a contract. Now, each class that implements this interface must provide the implementation. You'll notice here, I don't show you how it's done, but what just needs to be done. And all of these methods are public. So in IEmployee repository, notice we have 5 methods. Get all employees, get a single employee, insert, update, and delete. So inside of the class object that implements IEmployee repository will code up all the business rules for these 5 methods. In iStatusCode repository, notice that we have 6 methods that need to be implemented in the class object, all the way from get all status codes down to remove status code. You'll notice sometimes I end them with async. So these are asynchronous functions. And at the bottom, notice I don't use async, so these would be synchronous. Now the difference between the two are significant. Now, an asynchronous function means that 2 or more Operations can run in different contexts, while contexts mean threads, and they don't block each other. Now, synchronous is just the opposite. They all run in the same thread, and they can be blocked. And our last interface, IUserTaskRepository, notice has 6 methods. Get all active user task, get a single user task. I want to get all active tasks by employee. I want to insert a new task, update a task, and remove a task. So once again, these are just telling me this is what I want. When we write the class object that inherits IUserTaskRepository, we will implement the business rules. And there you have the interfaces. We have added several lines to program.cs. Let's make sure our code is the same. Notice I now have 4 using statements. You do not have to do API services. Now we still have our web application create builder. We still go and do an add DbContext. And now we have a new section. After we do repositories, we need to set up the lifetime scope. Like how often are these placed in the memory? And when we're saying builder service add scope, every time we initialize scope code repository, that is created once per request. So when we are looking for this, we get this. That's the way that works. Make sure you get those 3 lines. They're very, very important. Then we get down to add our controllers. We add Newtonsoft JSON, and we add the XML. You know about that from several of my videos. Now we say services, add endpoints, API Explorer, add Swagger, and then builder build. And then we've talked about this before about the ASP.NET Core environment to make sure that we can use Swagger. And then that finishes out with use HTTPS redirection, use routing, use authorization, map controllers, and run. And that finishes up program.cs. Now we have to create 3 files that we'll use to implement the interfaces: employee repository, status code repository, and user task repository. Please create those 3 files. The first thing we must do, we must inherit IRepository. And then notice that this has a red dots underneath it. Now what we can do is we can come click on this and say implement interface. And notice these are all the methods that we need to write. Notice the red bar is gone. If I remove even one of them, this should go back to red and say, hey, you are not following the contract. You have to implement all of the methods. You know, it's like, I just can't cherry pick the ones that I want. I have to go implement them all. So hopefully that's clear now. Our second class, status code repository, will interface iStatus code. Click on this and then say, go ahead and implement those for me. Notice we just have to code up these. And then our last object, user task repository. Let's go ahead and interface that. Click on this, drop down, interface. Nice. So all we have to do now is code these up and we'll be on our way. Now we have our 3 repository classes: user task, status code, and employee. Now we have to create constructors for each of these. Notice that we're going to be using DbContext. Now where did that come from? Remember over here, DbContext, it inherits DbContext. That's very important. This is how we connect to our database. Doesn't know about this, so we have to use the using, and now employee repository is all hooked up. Let's do our next one. We're just following a pattern now, just like we did an employee. And now we have our status code repository. This is the constructor. I don't know about that. Let's do a using statement. Now everything is hooked up on this, and we'll do our last one, user task. And we're pattern programmers, so we'll just do the same steps. I'm going to drop that in. Let's do a using. And notice that our constructor for user task repository is now all done. Now we're actually going to be able to use the database through context and start doing some commands. Now our first method that we need to code up is get all status codes async. Notice async, async, and then we have the await. So notice I'm going to go through the context. Here's our object status codes, and then I'm going to say order by the description, and then to list async. That's going to go to this object called list of status codes, and then I'm going to return that. So that's a pretty easy method, and that is our first. Our second method, get status code async. Notice I'm sending in a code. So here, async, wait, async. So I go through the context for our table, and I'm saying first or default, where that code equals the code that's in the table. If I find that, return that. Code is the primary key, so it should only ever turn at least one row. So 1 or 0 rows. And that is the second method. Our next method, insert status code async. So this is the async method. We have async here. We have awaits. And notice on our save changes, we have async. On add, we have async. And first or default, we have async. So let's see how this works. I'm going to go through the context for the table status codes. I'm going to try to find a record that has that code. Now, if I do find one entry is populated, but if I don't find it, which is what I want, then we can actually add another record to the table. Then I'm going to save the changes asynchronously, and then I'm going to return whatever you sent me. Now, if I find a record and I do have a value, entry is not null, then I'm going to return null. And that is the method insert status code async. Our next method, update status code. Notice it's synchronous. Let's see what that looks like. So I'm going to go up against context. That's our database connection for the table status code. And then I'm going to try and first or default. Notice first or default, it doesn't have the async on it. So we know that this is just a synchronous function. So I'm passing in an object. I'm just going to be looking for the code. Now, if I find that, oh, that's great. I'm trying to do an update command. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take see, this is an object. I'm just going to take the description and I'm going to update the description that's in the table. I'm then going to save changes. And that is update status code synchronously. Now, our last method in this status code repository is kind of complicated. Let's go through this slowly. I'm saying remove status code. But the first thing I do is I go through user task and I see if that status code has ever been used. Now, if and only if it's never been used, I can actually remove it from status code. If that status code even has one user task, then I can't remove it. You know, too bad, too sad. So look at this first one. Now notice this is a synchronous method. So I'm going to go through user task and I'm going to look for the column status code that's not null, and that status code equals that one I sent in. Now hopefully this comes back null. Now if it's null, I'm going to go through status code. I'm going to go find it. Now if I did find it, guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to remove it. And then I'm going to save changes. And then I'm going to return this status code to whatever called me. Now, had I found something in here, I'm going to skip it down here and I'm just going to return null. So this is a kind of complicated delete statement, but it's manageable. Good use of white space. And that is it for status code repository. Actually, we have one more thing I need to do. Remember this insert v2? Well, it was the same code as this. I'm not sure why I put this in here. But how do I remove it from here? Can I just delete this and say, bye-bye, gotta go? No, I can't do that. Remember, this is a contract. And it's telling me everything that was defined in here, you have to implement in here. So let's go look at iStatus code repository. Then notice here, I said, hey, I'm going to tell you what I want. In this one, do it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove it from here. Now removing it from here gives me the ability to remove it from here. So I can come down here and then remove this. So that's gone safely. And now we can save and compile and it's all done. And there you have the iStatus code repository and the implementation status code repository class. Let's now code up user task repository. We're going to start with get all active users task async. So let's see what I did. We're going to use our context, that's our database. Now we're going to use this table called user task. Now if the date complete is null and the status code not is com, which means complete, then let's get those and then let's order by the due date. And that's our first method, get all active user task. And let's do our next method now. Notice it is an asynchronous message and I'm going to return an IEnumerable list of user task. Now I come in here and I look at my name and do you see async at the end? Like I did this one? Like I did this one? Well, that would be an error. Not so much an error, but it's like a notification to a programmer that this is the async message. Just looking at this, I wouldn't know it. So let's go make the changes. Now, what do I have to change? Well, I have to change the contract. So I have to come over here and say async. And then I can take that name and I can come back to and update. So that's how it's done. So now we're going to go through our connection table, date completed equals null and status code not com, not complete. And I got an input parameter assigned to and assign p assigned to equals that input parameter. Then I'm going to do a toList and we're done with the second method. Our next method, get user task async. Notice I'm sending in task ID and I'm just returning one unit. Now this is nullable, so that means a user can send in a task ID that doesn't exist. So I will return null. I go through the database. Here's the table. Notice I'm doing first or default async for that task ID. And that is that method. Our next method, insert user task async. Notice that I'm going to send in a complete object. I want to make sure that title and due date doesn't exist. Now, if it does already exist, I'm not going to insert it. But if it doesn't exist, which entry will be null, then I'm going to say context user task add async, and I'm going to pass that whole object. Notice async, and of course we have to use await. And there is the insert user task async method. Let's look at remove user task. Notice that it is a synchronous method and it is nullable. That means it's quite possible I don't remove one. My user input is a entity object user task. And now I'm going to go try to find what the user is looking for just by task ID. Now remember, this is nullable, so it's possible someone sends me junk and then I can't find it. Now if I can't find it, I bypass this and I just return null. But if I find the entry that you're looking for, then notice I say entry not null. Notice here, I use that value in remove. I don't use this one, I use the one I'm looking for. And this is how you can remove that entry. Then I do a save changes, and then I return that entry. And that is remove user task. And here we're on our last method. Notice it's update user task. So I send in a complete object. Now I try to find that. Now if I do find that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that input parameter and I'm going to assign it to the record I just found. After I get done doing all the assignments, then I say save changes. Notice this is not a asynchronous method. And now save changes executes. This will update the database and then we'll return this entry. The entry is what we just saved to our database. Now if I don't find it, I'm going to return null. And there we have the user task repository implementation. Let's implement employee repository. Our first method, get all employees async, await. Notice that I say is active, order by first name, and then toList async, returning that to results, I return results. There's our first method. Our second method, we're sending in an input parameter to get employee async, and this is just going to get one employee. So we have an async method, async, first or default async, where employee ID equals our input parameters, return that to result, return result. It is possible employee ID does not exist, and this would just return null. Our next method, insert employee async. Notice I'm sending in an employee object. I'm then going to try to find it using first or default async by first name and last name. Now if that exists, I don't do anything. But if that does not exist, then I add async that object. And there you have insert employee async. Our next method, soft delete employee. I'm going to send in an employee object. I'm going to try to find that employee by his employee ID. Now, if I find that, I'm going to set his active state to false, and then I'm going to save changes. So notice soft delete doesn't actually remove a record. We're just changing the state of is active. Now, if that is successful, I'm going to return that employee object that just got updated. Or if I don't find that employee, I'm just going to return null. And there you have soft delete employee. In this final method, update employee, notice that I'm sending in an employee record. Now this object, I'm going to search for the employee by employee ID. Now if I find an entry, it will be in this object called employee. So if employee not null, that means I have a value. I'm going to take this input parameter object, EMP, and then I'm going to assign each field to the one that I just found. So whatever field changed, I don't know, but somebody called update. So I'm going to put first name, last name to last name, and is active to is active. Now, then I'm going to change that, and then notice I'm going to return employee. Now, employee is the record I just found, and I just updated from our input. Now, if I don't find that employee, I'm just going to return null. And there you have the employee repository implementation. Let's add a unit test project to the following solution, App API. So click on the solution, right click and say Add, New Project. Now C# All Platforms Test, see where it says xUnit Test Project? Then click Next. Then think of a good name. I'm going to call mine todo.api.unittest. Next. We're going to go .NET 6.0, hit create. That there has created us a project so we can write some unit tests. Our next step is to set a dependency between our test app and to-do API app. So see where it says dependencies, right click on that and say add project reference. And then notice it's going to go out to our current to-do API project. Click that and then say OK. let us rename this current unit test 1. We're going to call that test status code repository. Then going to come over here and say rename, and let's save that. So now we have a good name. We'll be able to come back to that later to see it and know what we're working with. Let's drop in a object so we can actually start writing our first test, and we're going to be using status code repository. So notice here I'm making it nullable. I assign null to it, and now it's saying, hey, what is that? So we just come over here and give us our using statement. Notice to do API services. So notice to do services, and then there is the status code repository that we'll be using. Before we do our first unit test, let's make sure we have some data in the table. Say use Task Manager. Task Manager is a database. It's also known as the catalog that we're going to be using. So select star from DBO status codes. There should be no data in there. If there is, use the delete from DBO status codes, or you can use the truncate table. And then do the insert command, and that puts us 2 rows of data. That's enough to get us going on this test. Let's write our first unit test. Now you have to start off with these usings. So 3, 4, and 5, they come from our project to do API. The 2 Microsoft, well, you know where they came from. And then xUnit. xUnit is part of this unit testing. So now we're into our class object. Now notice on 13, I'm creating a private global variable called status repository. It comes from the service over here, status code repository, no secrets. Now you'll notice this attribute fact. What does that use for? Well, that's an attribute from the testing, and it says if you put this on top of your function, it will be used by the test runner. Now if you leave this off, this method is bypassed. So the first 4 lines of this test get by type, I'm just pretty much setting up DbContext. I'm trying to get the database connectivity. Now notice here on line 20, get connection string. So I wrote a function down here called get connection string, and I have that connection string. Now where did I get that from? Well, do you remember when we were dealing with app settings, and app settings had a default connection, and there that connection string is? Well, guess what? I copied that, and then I put it down here in this test. That's all I did, so no tricks. Now once we have that connection string, I build this context, and then I start using it. Notice on 24, status repository equals new status code repository, and I pass in that context. Sweet. Now here's where it gets fun. Ready? Await. Notice here I'm using async, and then I'm going to call that status repository on get status code, and this is an async method. I'm going to be looking for COM. Notice I just said select star from status codes, and notice I get COM and updated, and then CR8 task created. On line 26, I'm actually going to call that status repository function get status by code. I'm going to send in com. You saw that COM existed. The description was updated. Now when this comes back, output may have a value, or it may be null. If I can't find this, it returns null. If I can find it, it's not null. I'm going to put a breakpoint on line 26 and line 20, and we're going to step through this. Let's do this. Come up to test, see where it says debug all test. Let's do it. So now it's compiling our program, getting it all ready. And now notice it just hit our project. Now once it hits our project, we can start stepping in there. So F10, 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 F10. Okay, now we're going to hit F11. F11 is going to step us into our to-do API, F11. I'm in there now. Now notice it's going to get status code where that code equals COM. F10. And notice the output comes back. I have an object and I get COM and updated. Then it's going to say, hey, is output not null? Assert that. So it does that. And then output not equal null. And then I'm going to say, does that code equal com? And it does. And guess what? This test is done. If we look at our runner, notice everything was good. On this second test, notice that we're going to be looking for AAA. Now, when I look at the database and I say select star from there, notice there is no AAA. So we would expect this function to return null. So what I do is on this one, I say assert for null for that output. I'm expecting it to be null. That's what I expect. So let's run this. So F10, F11 steps in there. I execute the function. Notice that I'm looking for AAA, F10. I'm back. Let's see what the Test Explorer tells us. Look at this. Test code not in table. I got the old check. Everything is good. And that is the second test. On our next test, see that we're doing test insert method. That's right. We have insert status code async. So you see async here, you see await here. Now notice I'm building a local variable called UPD. I'm putting WR4 and working, and then I'm going to try to insert that. If I query the database, notice we still have our two entries. There is no WR4. This should insert fine. Notice that I am testing the return value of this method. It's going to go to output. If output is not null, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to test output.description to see if it's working. See how I assigned working here? So let's do this test. Now notice on this one, I have 1, 2. I've turned all the tests on, but I only have one breakpoint. I'll meet you on line 60. Let's do this. Look where I'm at. I'm on line 60. Let's do this. Let's step into it. F10. I'm going to build a local status code, WR4 and working. Let's now go call that async method, insert status code async. F11 gets me in there. Now, the first thing as I do is I take that status code and I use the code and I say, hey, are you already in there? Are you in there? And it should say, no, I'm not in there. Then what it's going to say is context status code add async. Look at that. I'm passing the whole object to this add async method. Then I'm going to say save changes. And then I'm going to return that status code. Now when I get back, guess what? Is that null? No, look at that. It's got a value. What is that value? WR4 and working. My assert worked out. We're all done with our test. And notice, because I have the proper key fact, it went out there and did not in table, by type, and insert. And notice, I got all green check marks. Very good. In this method, we're actually going to test the update method. Now, there's this one and one more to go, and we are going to be done with unit testing. Now here, we're going to do the update command. And what we're going to do is we're going to take WR4 and whatever that is, we're going to set it to software nuggets. Notice when I hit the execute button, WR4 tells me its current value is working. We can see here I'm building a new object. WR4, I want to change it to software nuggets. I'm going to call this update status code. I'm going to send in this object. Now notice this method is synchronous. There is no async here. There is no await here. So we're just going to step into this. Let's do it. F11 steps us in. Now the first thing we're going to do is look at this as an object. And there we have our software nuggets. Now I'm just going to use the code part and I'm going to go through status code. I'm going to say, is WR4 in there? And it tells me, yeah, it's in there. What do you want to do? Well, I want to take that description, software nuggets, and I want to overwrite working. Let's do that. Now I'm going to say save changes. Notice this is a synchronous function. So we don't have no async at the end of this. Notice in other where we say async, notice it's save changes async. And notice whenever you have async, you have await. This method, synchronous, there is no await, there is no async, there is no await, and there is no async at the end of our functions. Let's execute this and see what happens. F10. So the function is back. Let's go look at SQL Server and see what the value is. And look what we have here, WR4 software nuggets. The update statement worked correctly. We're not done with the test yet. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say, not null. Can you assert that, yes or no? Well, we know that's not null. There's a value in there. So that will be successful. And output not null, guess what? I'm now going to test that description and see if that is software nuggets. Very good. Now let's take a look at the green bar. And notice our test update method was successful. Now we have one more test, the delete, and we are done with unit testing. We're looking at the final method, test remove method. Okay, so we remember we've been working with WR4. Now, like all things, it must end. I got to remove this. So we're going to call remove status code. Notice the object here has WR4 and software nuggets. It really doesn't matter what the description is. I'm going to delete with the primary key, and the primary key is code. Now, when we step in here, there's some business rules, and let's take a look-see at that. So I will meet you at the project. Let's do it, F11. Now, the first thing, notice that we go up against user task, and we say, hey, does that code, that code that we're trying to delete here, WR4, is that on any task? Because if it's already been assigned to a task, I can't delete it. So only if it's not assigned to any task can I actually remove it from the system. So let's step into this. So the first thing I do is I come in here and I do this. What happens? Guess what? It's null. So that means this status code, WR4, has never been used. Never been used. So that's null. So now I'm going to step in there and say, hey, for this code, WR4 and status code, look down here. I want to remove that. So I'm going to go find it here. And did I find it? Yeah, I found it. Now what am I going to do? I'm going to remove it. I'm now going to save changes. Well, now you know when you see save changes with no async on the end, you know this is a synchronous method. Notice synchronous here, and then I have no awaits here. Notice my first default doesn't have async either. So let's save these changes. Now let's return. And we're done. Now notice I'm going to do an output. What does my output say? Well, my output says software nuggets. Notice here I'm saying working. This will fail. You're going to see a big old error message come up here because somebody who wrote this test was lazy. They didn't check it all. So this is what happens when you have a failed test. Boink. Okay, so this is a problem, but we know it was successful. This actually did remove the entry. Let's go look at the database. Right-click on controller, and then we are going to add 3 controllers: employee, status code, and user task. Now when you get into this controller, when you right-click, add controller, make sure you select API and API controller empty for each one of those. Let's write the employee controller. Notice we have 5 using statements. Let's get those in there. And then we say route API open bracket, close bracket, the word controller. That picks up the word employee from the controller name. Now we say API controller. Notice we declare our variable underscore employee repository, and then we have a constructor. Let's make sure you get those in. Now, before we start writing these methods, I need to remind you of one thing. I interface with the customer through the DTO. I interface through the database with the entity object, just employee. At the bottom of this class, I have some helper functions that convert for me. Here you can see I'm converting from entity. So I start with employee and I return employee DTO. I just use a constructor. The second method, convert from DTO. Notice my input is a DTO, my return value is employee. Now remember, the DTO has just full name. I have to convert full name just to first name and last name. So I have a little helper function called split into FN and LN. Let's take a look at that. As you can see, that function is just a very easy split command, and I'm splitting by just the space character. So here I say an array of characters called sep, and it's just got one character in there, a space. Then I use full name, that's my input parameter, and I split that. I remove empty entries, and then I return buckets. The return value of this function goes into names. That's an array. Now I take that names and look at that names.length, the number of names that are in there. So if I have 2, you know I have a first name and a last name. If only 1, I have a first name. Anything other than 2 or 1, you get nothing. And then we set is active, and then I return results. And there is convert from DTO. Our last method is convert from list. Notice I have a list of employees, and my goal is to create a list of employee DTOs. So here I create a list of an empty list of employee DTOs, and then I loop over the list of employee, and then I call the method that we have above, convert from entity, and that produces a DTO, and I just populate this list, and then I return it when I'm done. So these helper methods are very, very important. Our first method, HTTP get, notice the name of the function is get all async. Well, it's async because it's the asynchronous method. Notice I'm going to return a list, enumerable, of employee DTO. So here I'm going to call our repository with get all employee async. That's going to return me a list of employees. Remember, when I'm at the database level, I'm entity object. Then I create an empty list of employee DTOs. I loop over it, and then I return that result. And that is our first method, get all async. Our next method just gets one employee, get employee async. Notice I'm sending in employee ID. Then on our repository, I'm looking for a method called get employee async. Notice this returns me just one instance of employee. Now, if I don't find employee, I'm going to return not found, 404. But if it is found, I'm going to convert it from entity to DTO. That's right, employee DTO. And then I'm going to return that value. And that is the method get employee async. Our next method, insert new employee async. Notice that it takes in from the user front end a DTO. Then what we do immediately is I convert that DTO to a rec. Then I try to use that rec into the employee repository method called insert employee async. Now if that's successful, then employee EMP results is not null. Then what I do is I give you a created, which is a 201, and then I give you a link for to pull up this one record. Now, if this comes back null, you get a bad request. And that is the method insert new employee async. Now our update, notice it's a HTTP put, and the name of this URL would be update employee. Notice we send it from the user interface, so that means it's a DTO, employee DTO. So right away, I have to convert that from DTO to employee. Then I use the method called update employee and I send in that converted record. Now, result, if it's not null, everything is good. If it's bad, you get a bad request. Notice all the heavy lifting is done in the repository. And that is the update employee. The last method is going to be called delete employee. Notice this is a HTTP delete. Now I'm going to be taking in from the user interface an employee. All I really need is the employee ID to delete someone, but I'm sending in the object. Now notice I convert right away from the DTO to employee. Then I'm going to be calling the repository soft delete. We never really delete anybody in this system. So if that is successful, then I return OK. If it's bad, then I showed you what you sent me and I tell you that was bad. And there you have the employee controller. Let's use Task Manager. And notice here I have inserted 3 rows into employees. Let's see those records. Notice we have software nuggets, someone smart, and absent-minded. Those are our 3 users. Our first method in our web API is API employee, get, try it, execute. We have our 3. Notice the record number 2, the employee ID is 2, someone smart. Let's go find him. We'll get the second one. So we're going to do a drop down. We're going to try it. The employee ID is 2. That should come back someone smart. Very good. Notice we're using the DTO, its full name here. Our next method was to insert someone new. Let's do that. So let's try it. And then I have to just come over here and type in some names. So some name. And then I'll say execute. And notice that one went in. And notice I said select star from employees. Some name is now employee number 4. Let's now use the update command and change his name, employee number 4. So 4, we're actually going to call someone. And then I'm going to say execute. And then notice someone. Let us execute the SQL statement. And notice now it is someone. And our last method we will execute is delete employee. Now remember, delete employee is actually a soft delete. We actually just change is active to false. Let's do this. I populate employee ID to 4. I hit execute. Notice I get back a 200. Let's go see what the database says. Notice I did the select star from employees and we got back is active 0 for someone. So everything worked great. The employee web service is done. Let us begin writing status code controller. We start off with the same 5 using statements as we did in employee controller. Then route API open bracket close bracket controller gets us status code as our route name. And then we have a private read-only underscore status code repository of type I status code repository. And then we create our constructor. And then we have to talk about our methods to convert it from a DTO to an entity back to a DTO. Let's go look at those. At the bottom of the class, we have these 3 methods: convert from entity, convert from DTO, and convert from list. So notice here I start off with status code. I convert it and I get status code DTO. I just use the constructor. First one is quite simple. Convert from DTO, notice my input is a DTO, my output is just status code. I declare a variable of type status code. I populate the 2 fields and then I return the value. This is actually quite easy as well. Our last one is my input is a list of status code, calling that input. my output will be a list of status code DTO. Notice I create a blank list of status code DTO. I loop over my input, and then I populate results. I then return results. So you see that we have three helper methods that let us go from one type to the other. They're very important. Our first method, HTTP get, notice it's called get all async. That will go get a list of all of the status codes. So it's an asynchronous function. Notice I'm returning a IEnumerable status code DTO. So my function get all status code async returns a list of status codes. We then have to convert the status code list into status code DTO. I stay inside that loop, I return results. And that's our first method, get all async. Our next method, notice the URL is get status code / codes. You're going to send me in the code. Notice it's an async method, get status code async. So code is sent in, I use it against my status code repository, get status code async. I'm passing code. Code was my input parameter. Notice I had to wait, it's async. So if this returns me a value, that's good. But if it's not good, it's null, I return not found. Now if it is found, I have to convert that status code into a status code DTO, and then I return that result. And that's the second method, get status code async. Our next method is an HTTP post insert new status code. Notice the async method. I'm sending in a DTO. Now, you know, sending in a DTO, I have to convert it back to a status code. I do that right in line here. And then I take this rec and I send it to my status code repository, insert status code. Now that is a asynchronous method. And then I return created. Created gives me a 201. And that is the insert new status code async. Our next method, update status code, HTTP put. The URL is update status code. Notice I'm sending in a DTO. Now that DTO needs to be converted right away to a status code. That's an entity class. And then I'm going to call the method update status code on status code repository. Now if that's successful, it won't be null. I return OK, a 200. If this returns null, that's bad. I'm going to show you what you sent me. And that's the update status code method. Our last method, HTTP delete remove status code. Notice remove status code input parameter is a DTO status code. Now I have to convert that right away from a DTO back to our entity class. Then I'm going to call the method remove status code. That's on the status code repository. Once again, if it's all good, I'm going to send you back 200. If it's bad, I'm going to say, hey, that code doesn't exist. And there you have the status code controller. Let's take a look at this in Swagger. We're in Swagger, we're looking at status code. Look at our first method. Go get a list of the codes. Let's see what's available before we dive in. Select star from status codes. Notice we have two entries, a complete and a created. Let's now try this. Execute, we should have two. Notice we have task completed and task created. Our next service call is just to get one of them. Notice we can come here, try it, and then we'll say, look for COM. That was completed. Hit execute. Notice we got it. Very good, that's our second. Our third method, insert new status code. Let's try one. Let's do this. And now the code will be, how about WRK? And we can say working. And then we can say execute. Notice we get a 201, which is created, and we have WRK and working. Let's prove that at the database layer, and notice we have working. Our fourth method, update status code. Let's change working to something else. So let's try it. And then I'm going to say, okay, my status code is WRK. And then instead of working, let's try something funny. All right, execute. And notice it's something funny. Let's go check the database. As you can see, it used to be WRK working. Let's execute the select statement. Now it's something funny. And our last method is to delete some. So remove status code. Let's try that. Let's try it. Which one are we going to delete? How about we delete working? WRK. We don't need a description. We can say execute. And that gave us a 200, so it should be gone. Let's check the database. Drum roll, please. And it's gone. It worked great. Second web service, all done. Let us begin the user task controller. Notice we have our 5 using statements. Our route, that is bracket controller, that picks up user task. And then we have our variable underscore user task repository, and then our constructor. Our first method, get all active user tasks async, that's going to get all the active user tasks. And notice this is an async method, so we have to await here. That right there returns our entity, a list of user tasks that are active. Now, I can't send that back to the client, so I have to create another list of type user task DTO. Then what we're going to do is we're going to loop over this variable active user task, and then we're going to populate results. As soon as I'm done with that, I'm going to return that to the user. We're now looking at the second method. Note it is called getUserTaskAsync. Now, if we come and look at the HTTP GET, notice the URL. See that task ID? That word and this word have to be the same. That's just the way it works. And notice once we get inside of the method, I pass that int task ID into the method getUserTaskAsync. That's on the repository, user task repository. Now, we're using async, so I have to await. Now, the return value of getUserTaskAsync from the repository is an entity. Now, I can't return an entity to the end user. Now, if that task is null, I'm going to return not found. Now, if it is found, I have to convert that to a DTO, user task DTO. And everything is good, I'm going to return OK with those results. And that's getUserTaskAsync. Our next method, get all active tasks by employee async. Notice is the async method. Async, we have to wait. Our repository is going to call the same method name, and I'm going to send that assign to that method. That goes into user task. Now, user task is a list. Notice it is a list of type user task. Now, user task is entity. So if I don't have any results, I return not found. Now, if they are found, we have to create an empty list of user task DTO. I then loop over our results on line 83, and I start building results. When I'm done with that, I return results. And that's get all active tasks by employee async. Our next method, get user task async. This is like, insert user task async. In this method, insert user task async, notice I get a complete object. It comes from the user interface, so I'm getting a user task DTO. Now, as soon as I get into the method, guess what I have to do? I have to convert that over to just a simple class, user task. This is an any class. In this method, insert user task async, notice that I get a user task DTO. Now, user task DTO, that comes from a user interface. As soon as we enter our method, we need to convert that to our entity class, user task. Now, I'm going to take that rec and notice that I'm going to try to insert that into this method called insert user task async. Now, if that is successful, I'm going to give you back a 201 created. Then I'm going to give you a URL. I'm going to give you the task that we got back. Remember, task ID is an identity column. This will be populated after this gets inserted. And then I'm also sending you back the user task that you sent in. Now, if this returns null, I'm going to come down here and give you back a bad request. Update user task. I'm also sending in another DTO user task, and here I actually just want to do an update. So I have to convert the user task into the entity user task. And then I'm going to call the user task repository update user task, and I'm going to pass in that entity class. Now, if the results are not null, you're going to get an OK, and I'm going to send you back task. Now, if it's null, you're going to get a bad request. And that's the end of update user task. Remove user task, that sends in a DTO as well. So the user is asking me, please remove a user task from the database. But a DTO is what the front end uses. I have to convert that to an entity class. I then call the method off user task repository, remove user task. I send in the converted type. If it's good, I send back OK. If it's bad, I tell you, hey, that user task did not exist. Now at the bottom of our class, we have some methods that allow us to change the data types. Here you can see I'm going from user task DTO to task, a very simple method. Our next one is we're going from user task to user task DTO. So just the opposite of this one. And that is all the source code we need to manage user task controller. Let us use Swagger and test out our 6 methods. Our first one is get user task. So click get, try it out, hit execute. And notice that we have 3 tasks, task ID 1, 2, and 3. Notice I said select star from task and we got task 1, 2, 3. We'll now try the next method, get user task async. Notice I have to send in a task ID. So I'm going to try it, and I'm going to try to get the second one. Hit execute. And the second one tells me it's second task. Nice. Notice I don't have anybody assigned to a task yet. Let's search for somebody. Our third method, get all active tasks by employee. So let's come down and try to do that. Assign to 1 should return us nothing. Empty set, very good. Notice I did an update statement, update user tasks, set assign to 1, where task ID is 3. Let's do that same query again. Here we go. I'm going to try it. I'm going to assign it to 1. Execute, and now we get the third task. Let's now insert a user task. Try it out. Here I've created a new task, 4th task, due June the 6th, 2022. I'm going to assign it to number 2. Status is going to be working, and date complete is still set to null. Let's execute that. Notice it is successful. 201 is created. And notice that my fourth task assigned to person 2 and is working. Let's now try the update put method. So I'm going to try it. I did quite a few changes on this. Notice my title will now be called update of 4th. It currently is 4th task. The date due, I changed it by 1 day. It'll be on the 2nd. Assigned to is currently to number 2. I'm assigning it to 1. And notice the task is currently WRK. I'm changing it to create CR8. Let's do this. As you see, it was successful, and our database was updated appropriately. Our last method is to remove that user task. And all we really need to do is fill in the task ID. I'm going to say 4. I got to say try it first. 4. And then execute. And we get a 200. Notice 4 is in there. Let's do a select statement, see if it was removed. And yes, 4 has been removed. And there you have our user tasks web service. Hey team, we're at the end of the video. Congratulations. This was a great learning video about web APIs. We taught so much about this ASP.NET 6, code first, repositories, DTOs, unit testing, and web services. That's a lot to know. Now, is there more to know? Yes, quite a bit actually. And in my next video, I'll be showing you some more. Now, until that next video comes out, I recommend you practice this one. Become the master. Maybe design your own database. Make your own little project and do that. In my next video, we'll be looking at security, like authorization, JWT, and we'll be just looking at a couple more things that are very, very interesting about web development on the back end. For instance, if you must know, we'll be writing functions and stored procedures instead of doing code first. And then we'll be integrating that through Entity Framework. Now, I appreciate you watching this video. I appreciate everything that you guys do for my channel, leaving comments, a thumbs up, subscribing. If you're new to my channel, I'd appreciate, all those three. Thumbs up, if and only if you like the video. A comment, not only for myself, but for other users. If you see something in the video that you can make clearer, ask questions about, and maybe even recommend doing a different way, I would really appreciate that. And if you're really new to the channel and have never seen my videos, I'd appreciate subscribing, but only if you think that you will follow and see other videos of mine. And there you have it, team. I'll see you back in my next video. Have a great week.